The Boy in the Wooden Box, Chapter 10. After the soldiers left, the gate swung open. I was in shock. We all were. We had gone from years of imprisonment to freedom. I felt confused, weak, and ecstatic all at once. Disoriented and uncertain, we continued to drift around the Brunlitz camp for 2 days. I couldn't absorb the fact that we were now liberated, even as our enemies, the vanquished German soldiers, streamed past us by the hundreds. I stood and watched them, the once confident troops, now dejected prisoners of the Soviets. Hour after hour they trudged by, their heads down, their expressions sullen. Some of the Jewish workers contemplated revenge. A few grabbed the soldiers' boots and tossed their own wooden clogs at them in exchange. I didn't join in. There was no way to even the score with the Nazis, no matter what I did. All I wanted was to remember those hours forever. Remember the sight of the once proud soldiers straggling past us in abject fear. Eventually, the Czech authorities provided free transport by trains for those of us who decided to return to Poland. My mother longed to go all the way to Norwega to find Herschel and her family, but my father said it was too dangerous to travel that far east. Instead, he decided that the five of us would return to Krakow. Of course, we nurtured the secret hope that somehow Salik had escaped and would be there waiting for us. This time, the cattle cars had bunks, and the sliding doors remained open. We could breathe in the smells of springtime and watch the passing countryside. From my spot, I surveyed the scenery and noticed a few signs of the war that had decimated our lives. Trees sprouted new leaves, wildflowers were blooming. The scars from the war, which I felt so deeply, weren't visible in the passing landscape. It was almost as if these terrible years of suffering had never happened. But I only had to look at the worn and weary faces of my parents to know otherwise. As the train rumbled eastward, I allowed myself to do something I hadn't done in years, to think about the future. For the past 6 years, thinking about the future had meant only thinking about how to survive the next hour, how to find the next scrap of food, how to escape the next brush with death. Now the future meant much more. I might be able to return to school. I might be able to have a home, adequate food, security. One day, I might feel safe again. The train stopped frequently to let passengers off at points near where they had come from. Each time, passengers climbed out and quickly left without looking back or saying goodbye. There was no reason to prolong the ordeal a moment longer. I watched my former co-workers scatter across Poland one by one, family by family. All of us prayed that our suffering was over, that we could go back to our lives, to the families from whom we had been separated for so long. Sadly, in Krakow, I soon realized the suffering wasn't over. My parents, Deva, Pesa, and I arrived still wearing our striped prison uniforms. We clutched our only possessions, bolts of cloth and the bottles of vodka that Schindler had secured for us, and walked tentatively through the city toward our old neighborhood. We were greeted by curious stares and indifference that completely unsettled me. We found Wojak, the kind Gentile that had sold my father's suits, and we connected with a former neighbor from Premlosawa Street. He let us stay in his apartment for a few nights and decided to throw a little party for my father. Over shots of vodka from one of our precious bottles, he confessed he was surprised that we had survived. It became clear that many others in the city shared this surprise. To some, the Jews' unexpected return was not welcome. They wondered what we would expect from them. They had suffered their own hardships and losses during the war and weren't interested in ours. Some were anti-Semitic and had been pleased to see us out of what they considered to be their country, despite the fact that the Jews had lived there for over 1,000 years. Now we were back, causing them anxiety, though we were simply trying to adjust to freedom and begin rebuilding our lives. My mother found a tailor who sewed a pair of pants for me from my bolt of cloth, my first new trousers in nearly 6 years. His payment was the fabric remaining on the bolt. My father was able to get his old job back at the glass factory. We urgently needed a place of our own. We found lodging in a student dormitory that had become a receiving center for refugees. That's what we were now, I realized. Refugees. Outsiders, ironically, in a country where Jews had a long history. At the end of the war, the Krakow's pre-war Jewish population of about 60,000, only a few thousand remained. The dormitory housed homeless, the other returning homeless as well. As in the ghetto, we divided the room into sections using ropes with blankets draped over them. Soon there were more and more people looking for space as Jews returned to the city in search of their families and trying to reclaim their homes and their pre-war lives. Many of them came from Soviet-occupied areas in the east. One day, my mother found a young woman and her mother sleeping in the hallway. My mother insisted that they share our space. Gradually, each of the four corners filled with a different family. That summer, the backlash in Krakow against the returning Jews intensified. A Jewish woman was falsely accused of kidnapping a Gentile boy. Rumors circulated that emaciated Jews returning from the camps were using Gentile children's blood for transfusions, a revival of the ancient accusation known as blood libel. The accusation in the past and present was false and ridiculous, but it nonetheless put the city on edge. A mob gathered outside one of the remaining synagogues, shouting slurs, and then came to our building to throw rocks at the windows. After an hour or so, the hoodlums left, but the violence revived old fears. Once again, I longed to be invisible. My father went to work every day while the rest of us spent most of our time inside our makeshift home, afraid to venture out. Was this to become our future? Had we survived the war and the ghetto camps only to continue to live in dread? I just want to point out really quickly that this is kind of in contrast. One of the students asked the survivor that we met at the Holocaust Center about how the people were when they returned after the war, and she had said that they were actually very friendly and welcoming. And I thought this was a stark contrast to what I knew from this book. It's interesting how people behaved when these Jewish people who had gone through so much returned to their home. So, something to think about. On August 11th, 1945, rioting broke out when a Gentile boy claimed that Jews were trying to kill him. Hooligans attacked our building, again pelting the windows with rocks, pulling people from the first floor to beat them with their bare hands. We scrambled from our room to the safety of a higher floor. Everywhere else in the city, rioters looted a synagogue and burned the Torah scrolls. There were reports that Jews beaten in the streets had been hospitalized only to be beaten again. At the factory, my father had been warned not to leave after work. The streets were too dangerous, so we stayed overnight in relative safety. My mother, my siblings, and I faced a long night on our own. The next day, after my father returned from the factory, we told him what had happened the night before. He remained silent. "We can't stay here," David said to my father. "If we could go back to Narweka," my mother offered. She often said this after the war. She never felt at home in the city and certainly had no reason to alter that feeling now, but the real reason for her longing to return to Narweka was the thread of hope that at least some of our family, especially my oldest brother Herschel, had survived. "We can't go back yet," responded my father. "Maybe never." My father related this devastating news. My mother listened, horror-struck, as he told us what he had learned from his factory contacts originally from Narweka. Some had managed to go back to look for family. What they reported was terrifying. Following the invading German army, mobile killing squads of the SS called Einsatzgruppen had swept through the villages of eastern Poland with the sole purpose of murdering Jews. We remember that they had, lined people up, shot them, burying them in mass graves. They reached Narweka in August 1941. They took all the Jewish men in the village, some 500, to a meadow near the forest, machine-gunned them down, and buried them in a mass grave. They took the women and children to a nearby barn where they held them for a day, and then they too were executed. In one blow, all of our extended family in Narweka, some 100 relatives, my grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, had been murdered. It was beyond belief. As she thought of her parents, my mother could only whisper, "I hope they died before the Einsatzgruppen arrived." All at once, the full impact of what had been told hit us. We had never heard from Herschel in those 6 long years we had been separated. We assumed he had made it to Norwega, which in 1939 was under Soviet control and had seemed a safer place for him than Krakow. Now we learned that Herschel had indeed made it back to Norwega only to be taken prisoner and murdered by the SS assassins on that terrible day in August. My mother collapsed as the rest of us stood, stunned by the atrocity. Many years later, I went back to Norwega. A Gentile Pole I met there spoke of how one young Jew had tried to run, but, as he said, one of ours, in other words, a non-Jew, spotted him and reported him to the SS, who shot him immediately. As I think about my impetuous brother, I can imagine him being that young man who made a run for the forest, doing everything he possibly could to try to survive. As the weeks passed, life did not improve. There were constant reports of recurring hostility toward Jews. Jobs were scarce and so was food. The future for us in Krakow looked bleak. Early in 1946, David and Pesa devised a plan to go back to Czechoslovakia to see if they could settle there. I went with them across the border. After a few days, however, my mother sent word through a friend that she needed at least one of her children to be with her. As the youngest, still only 16, I was the obvious choice. I said goodbye to David, and Pesa took me back to Krakow. She then returned to Czechoslovakia and David. It hurt to say goodbye to my brother and sister. Amazingly, we had managed to stay together for the last years of the war. Now they were adults and eager to begin anew. My parents would have tried to dissuade them. A few months later, my parents enlisted the help of a Zionist organization, one of the groups whose goal was to establish a Jewish nation-state. We hoped that they could smuggle us out of Poland. We did not consider going to British-controlled Palestine, as life there would be too arduous for my parents. After several weeks of anxiously waiting, our window of opportunity came. We paid a guard a small bribe and slipped across the border. We traveled by train through Czechoslovakia, arriving finally in Salzburg, Austria. There, a United Nations relief organization assigned us to a displaced person camp in Wetzlar, Germany, in the American occupation zone. On one hand, it seemed strange to be in Germany, of all places. On the other, it felt good to be opening a new chapter in our lives. Homeless, stateless, in yet another camp, we could have felt defeated, but Wetzlar was very different from the camps during the war. We had 3 meals a day, reliable medical care, and the protection of the U.S. military. Pretty good. Most importantly, we could come and go as we pleased. I took every opportunity to go into town and strike up a conversation with anyone willing to talk to me. I befriended other teenagers in the camp, including a pretty Hungarian girl my age. I learned to speak fluent Hungarian just so I could talk with her. In fact, some Hungarians were so convinced that I was Hungarian that they spoke Polish when they didn't want me to understand what they were saying. Little did they know that Polish was my native language. To my mother's delight, I put on weight, began to fill out my skeletal frame, and grew several inches. My hair came back dark and thick. I had new clothes made by tailors in the camp, who ripped apart military uniforms at the seams and refashioned them into civilian clothes. Someone even gave me a hat, a brown fedora. It became my trademark. I wore it everywhere, emulating in my own way my father's pre-war flair for style. Occasionally, my new friends and I would argue about who had it worse during the war. Some had been in labor camps, some in concentration camps, some even in the infamous Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp. Others had been in hiding in many different circumstances. We couldn't resist the urge to swap stories and exchange information, even though such conversations sometimes led to jealousy and anger. In a strange way, we seemed to be vying for the worst experience. We all had been through our private hells, and we were still processing what we had experienced. None of us knew what to do with the enormous burden of our memories. Sometimes the pain of our grief would break through the surface and threaten the fragile friendships that we were nurturing. I never felt like camp was home, but I began to get used to the life there as we waited to see which country might allow us to immigrate. There were lots of people like us looking for a place that would take them in. The Germans had ended my schooling shortly after I turned 10. My parents were concerned about my lack of education and what that might mean for my future. My father began looking for someone to tutor me and help me make up at least part of what I had lost. In a nearby town, he found a former German engineer who was now unemployed and had 5 children to feed. 3 times a week for 2 years, I went to Dr. New's house to be tutored in mathematics and drafting. We began with basic arithmetic and worked our way up to the complexities of trigonometry. Over time, I came to look forward with my lessons with Dr. New. After my experience with Oskar Schindler, I felt I could tell the difference between those Germans who had been true Nazis and those who had retained some humanity, even if they had joined the Nazi Party. I found that the true believers would look down at their shoes or wind their watches when someone mentioned the war. When someone spoke of what the Jews had gone through, their stock response was, "We didn't know." Dr. New wasn't like that. He asked me questions. He asked about my experience and generally listened to what I told him. I was reminded of how Oskar Schindler had asked me questions and waited for my answers. Dr. New didn't try to whitewash what had happened. One time, when I was telling him a story, his wife overheard us. "We didn't know," she muttered. He gave her a piercing look and said, "Don't say that." After the awkward moment passed, he urged me to continue with my story. Through Jewish organizations, my parents connected with a few of our relatives in the United States. My mother's sister Shana, her brother Morris, who had left Norwega in the early 1900s, now lived in Los Angeles. Uncle Carl had died shortly after arriving in the United States. Based on the reports they heard, they had come to believe that all their family in Poland had been murdered. They were ecstatic to learn that there were 3 of us in a displaced persons camp. Our American relatives wrote letters and sent packages to us, packages filled with food donated by friends from Norwega now living in the United States. Since we didn't have any money to pay Dr. New for my tutoring, we gave him items from our care packages. Coffee and cigarettes and food items from the DP camp my family would not eat, like canned ham. Jewish people don't, at least observant Jews, don't generally eat pork products. So it's just an aside. In 1948, Pesa and David joined the Zionist group and left Czechoslovakia for the new state of Israel that had been founded that very year. That would be in Palestine, and that's a whole nother kettle of fish. All right. When we received word of their plans, I wanted to go with them, but by this time my parents had decided that we would go to the United States as soon as my aunt and uncle could make the arrangements. My parents reasoned that in America we could find jobs, help support my sister and brother, whose lives had not been easy in a country struggling to establish itself. Although I was almost 19 and longed to join my brother and sister, after all my parents had been through, I couldn't refuse their plea for me to stay with them. At last, in May 1949, after nearly 3 years in the displaced persons camp, we received word that our immigration request had been approved. Almost beyond belief, we were really going to the United States of America. We took the train to Bremerhaven, Germany, and then traveled on a former troop ship for 9 days across the Atlantic Ocean to Boston, Massachusetts. I spent all the time I could on deck watching the ocean stretching in all directions. Something about its majesty, its vastness, brought me a peace I had not known before. We slept in hammocks below deck and battled seasickness, although I wasn't as badly affected as some. We refugee passengers represented many nations and spoke many languages. I was awed by how many of the languages I didn't know. What we didn't speak was English, so we had identification tags on our jackets to make sure we ended up in the right place. Uncle Morris's son, David Goldner, who lived in Connecticut, found us as we were being processed by immigration after our ship docked in Boston Harbor. During the immigration procedures, our last name changed to Layson. I'd already abandoned Leave for the much cooler, I thought, name of Leon. David knew only a little Yiddish and no Polish, so he did more pointing than speaking as he directed us from the port to the train station. He gave us spending money for the 5-day trip to Los Angeles, California. It felt good to ride the train this time, to sit in a passenger car in a plush seat, not crammed in a cable car. Probably some people would think our trip was an ordeal. We slept in our seats. There wasn't a shower for us to use. But for me, every minute of the trip was wonderful. I spent hours sitting by the window watching the world pass by as we went from East Coast to Chicago, then across the Midwest and through the Southwest. Our lack of English made for some confusing moments along the way. For example, whenever we went to the dining car, all we could do was point at what someone else was eating or to a few incomprehensible words on the menu. We often ended up with some very strange combinations. I also had no idea how the prices on the menu corresponded to the money in my pocket, so I would hand the waiter a large bill and wait to receive change. I gradually accumulated a larger and larger stack of coins. Back in my seat in the passenger car, I would study them and try to figure out what was worth what. Of course, I could read the numbers on the coins, but that was not the same as understanding the values. One afternoon, a woman a few seats away from me observed me looking at the change I had just acquired from paying for lunch. She left her seat and came over to sit next to me. She smiled and took a coin out of my hand. "This is a nickel," she said. She picked out another coin. "This is a dime," she continued. "And this one's penny." We went over the denominations a few times. 1 cent, 5 cents, 10 cents, 25 cents. After I learned how to say the names and values, the woman smiled again and returned to her seat. She probably forgot the incident in a few days, but I never have. I still remember her kindness nearly 65 years later. She gave me my first English lesson. On the train, I watched as the scenery went from lush greens to dramatic reds to dry desert browns. We crossed the Continental Divide and the Mojave Desert. I thought about this new country that would now be my home. The future lay before me in a way that only a brief time before I would have thought impossible. I wasn't scared at all, even though I didn't know the language, nor have a clue what I would do. I was just excited. For the first time in many years, I could daydream about the future. I knew I would learn English. I would get a job. Someday, I would marry and have a family. I might even live to be an old man. Anything could happen. As the train pulled into Union Station in Los Angeles, my mother, father, and I gathered our belongings and readied to leave. I picked up my fedora and started to put it on, but then I reconsidered. I tossed the hat back on the luggage rack and turned to leave. That hat was part of my previous life, the life I had intended to leave behind. With quarters, nickels, and dimes jostling in my pocket, I stepped off the train and into the California sunshine. I was 19 years old and my real life was just beginning.